they're perfectly prepared to shatter the norms. We're still better off than we were in the 20th century, but if you look at the curve of democracy, with some ups and downs, it kind of hit a peak in the early years of the 21st century, and it's started to droop. Harvard is being mugged. There are no longer gatekeepers. The right in the United States has rediscovered the joys of cancel culture originally invented by the left and have demonized, shamed, mobbed, fired, punished people who have dissented from the posthumous canonization of Charlie Kirk.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. Steven Pinker is the arch rationalist, one of the world's leading public intellectuals and best-selling author. We have managed to get him into our London studio to talk about his new book, all about the phenomenon of common knowledge. It's called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. And while we've got him here, we're going to try to apply this way of thinking, this mode, to some of the political and cultural situations here in Europe and in the US and see where it gets us. So, Steven Pinker, welcome back to UnHerd.
Thank you.
And congratulations. How's the English leg of the tour been?
It's been great fun. I've gotten a lovely reception, receptive audiences.
You haven't found the kind of Twitter version of the United Kingdom to be true, then, that we're kind of a place where you can't even walk around speaking freely because you're going to get arrested by police? Or
so far, I have not been arrested, and I haven't seen any arrests. So I have read about this regrettable phenomenon, but have not seen it with my own eyes.
Let's start by just laying out the thesis a little bit for our listeners and watchers. So, what is common knowledge, and why does it matter?
So common knowledge in the technical sense refers to the case where I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know that you know it, ad infinitum, which seems impossible, but it is of interest because, to begin with, it is different from private knowledge. There are qualitative differences between you and I knowing something and you and I, each of us knowing that the other knows it, and so on. In particular, it's required for coordination, for two people making complementary choices that may be arbitrary, but that benefit them both if they both make it. A simple example would be driving on the right or driving on the left. There's no inherent advantage to doing one or the other, but it is very important that everyone pick the same side and that everyone knows that everyone else is going to pick the same side. And common knowledge licenses coordination on scales large and small, everything from two people meeting for a coffee date and wanting to be at the same cafe, to phenomena like paper currency, which depend on the common knowledge that it's valuable. The piece of paper has no value other than the fact that I'll accept it in exchange for something of value, knowing that you, in turn, will get something of value by exchanging it with others who, in turn, will exchange it with still others. It's just propped up by the common knowledge that it has value. Authority, technological standards, the social realities that make coordination possible depend on common knowledge. Now, this raises the psychological question. I approach it as a psychologist. How could any mortal human ever hold the thought that I know that she knows that I know that she knows? Your head starts to hurt after one or two levels, let alone an infinite number, which can't fit in a finite skull. And the resolution is that common knowledge can be granted at a stroke when something is conspicuous, public, out there. When I see it and you see it and I see you see it and you see me see it, that carries in it tacitly the logic of common knowledge, even if we don't reel out all the I think that he thinks. And so it creates a role for conspicuous events in creating social realities because a conspicuous event can generate common knowledge. Right. The final twist of, if I dare to call it a theory, and I think my contribution above and beyond the work that I report from game theorists and economists and philosophers and political scientists, is that I think that our informal social relationships are also matters of common knowledge. That what does it mean for two people to be friends? It's not as if they sign a legal contract. Each one knows that the other one knows that the other one knows that they're friends. Or romantic partners, or in positions of deference and authority, or in a transactional relationship. These are qualitatively different coordination games that depend on common knowledge to implement them, but that can also be exploded by contradictory common knowledge, giving rise to all of the social phenomena of innuendo, politeness, euphemism, benign hypocrisy, pretending not to see the elephant in the room. All of these social rituals can be made intelligible by seeing how they create or, on the contrary, prevent common knowledge.
And I guess for us, where we have more of a political interest, when you scale up those factors, it's incredibly influential in the political conversation, this concept, isn't it? It feels perhaps even more so now than ever. Both, I suppose, common knowledge can then be a kind of gatekeeping function. The so-called Overton window can be a matter of common knowledge, that you just don't ask certain questions.
Indeed.
And a lot of people seem at the moment to be having political success by busting open those questions that were previously taboo.
Yes, so the Overton window is an example of a norm. It's a way of doing things that isn't literally enforced by law, but a matter of common knowledge. A norm like you don't tell ethnic jokes. It used to be that people did tell them on broadcast television. You don't insult people to their face. You don't comment on a woman's appearance. All of these exist because everyone knows they exist. That's what you do if you're a competent member of a culture. But since they depend on common knowledge, they're in danger of unraveling if someone flouts them in a public arena, a place where everyone sees them flouted, sees everyone else see them flouted. Then it's not a norm anymore, which also gives rise to the phenomenon of policing norms by being sensitive to a norm being flouted in a public setting, in common knowledge, and therefore feeling the urge to punish the violator also in a public setting in order to keep the norm a norm, because the norm only exists if everyone knows that it exists.
And another word for that is cancel culture, perhaps.
Well, yes. So when it is applied in just genteel, polite society, it's what makes civilized life possible. But there are arenas in which some norms are inapplicable. In academia, in journalism, in a court of law, in government, you don't want to avoid hurting people's feelings. You want to get to the truth. That's a different norm. And so they can sometimes come into conflict. Cancel culture arises when there is a feeling that a norm of violating some orthodoxy, something that people feel has a moral purpose, if it's flouted in public, people feel it must be punished in public. Social media make a lot of things public and also present the temptation to punish things in public. Namely, you mob and denounce a miscreant in social media. The problem being that in an academic setting, in an intellectual setting, since your goal is to find the truth, you can't always be worried about hurting people's feelings. And sometimes the norms, the common beliefs have to be challenged if you're going to make progress.
Yeah, and you've made a lot of important interventions in recent years, pushing back against, within the academic setting, some of those questions that have been deemed unacceptable to ask. And in fact, you open your chapter on cancel culture by listing some of those questions.
Yes,
so I thought I'd just fire some of them at you.
A naughty list, yes.
Your naughty list. Well, they were interesting. It was an interesting collection of questions that you chose. Do women, on average, have a different profile of aptitudes and emotions than men? What is the answer to that question?
Well, the answer is irrelevant for this context, because the question is, can you say it? And of course, famously, the reason that I began with that is that the president of my university and my close friend Larry Summers was defenestrated for raising that question. The point of this book is not to answer any of those questions. The thing is why do people feel that it is evil to ask them?
I know, but you've chosen these questions. They're the interesting collection because each of them, I would suggest, they're well chosen because the answer to each of them is not categorically no, at least, if not necessarily yes. You know, I'm wondering whether that is the reason you chose them.
I chose them because they have been triggers for cancellation attempts. It's often considered to be immoral even to think those thoughts. That's the hallmark of taboo. And so In this book, even though I am an activist for defending academic freedom, I co-founded the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, the point of this book was not to prosecute that war, but rather as a psychologist to try to understand the impulse behind canceling, hence the canceling instinct. That is, prima facie, you might think, well, you're a scientist, you're an academic, you're a journalist. Of course you raise questions, and it's just a question of whether they're true or false, and you don't know whether they're true or false before you broach them, and so you might be mistaken, but you can't be evil. That is the ideal. That's how academia, journalism ought to operate. In reality, human beings don't think that way. They do think that it can be immoral to raise a question, to broach a hypothesis. And so the question I raised in this book is, where does that impulse come from? What is the canceling instinct?
I'm just going to read a couple more out so that our audience can get a sense of what you mean.
I suspect that it's not going to be true of this audience, but for some audiences, their blood pressure would rise with every question.
I think the UnHerd audience is pretty resolved to hearing difficult questions.
I believe that.
Would a rapid reduction in fossil fuel consumption do more harm than good? Is sudden onset gender dysphoria in adolescent girls an effect of social contagion? Are polar bears thriving as opposed to going extinct? Are differences in intelligence between individuals partly heritable? What about average differences between ethnic groups? Do police shoot a larger proportion of unarmed African Americans than whites when differences in crime rates among neighborhoods are taken into account? And so on. So each of these questions has given rise to a fraught conversation, and there have been attempts within academia to shut them down.
Yes, fraught would be somewhere between a euphemism and an understatement.
Right.
Yes.
Just to dig into those, are there any questions in that list where you would share the instinct to push against even asking the question?
There might be, and I end that chapter by broaching that possibility, noting that in our social lives, we often do hold our tongues. We don't say what's on our mind. That is, we keep certain knowledge private. You can think it, but blurting it out can change everything. In general, I argue that truth-seeking professions like academia and journalism and history and criminal justice should not work by the same rules as genteel, polite conversation. Are there cases, though, where the harms could outweigh the benefits? And you, of course, can never sanction untruths, lying, but is there a space for not going there, not asking the question, in the same way that a socially competent adult keeps certain things to himself or herself? You don't blurt everything out. Might that be true in science? And I don't come down hard on it, but I do steel man the possibility that when it comes to something like, say, race differences in intelligence, maybe we don't need to get to the bottom of it. It's not a central scientific issue. It could do a lot of harm depending on what the answer turns out to be. Maybe we can be perfectly happy devoting our attention and resources to other questions.
Is that not quite a major concession, though? Because if you concede the principle that some academic questions are better not asked, then it's just a matter of judgment as to which ones they are. Someone might say, well, the climate question, the polar bear question, don't even ask it because the answer will be too sophisticated. It will be misused in the press. The evil right-wing media will seize on it, and net will be bad for the planet. Therefore, don't ask it. That's sort of the instinct that has led to this.
It can open the door to that. So it is a question of judgment calls. And the reason I don't endorse the don't go there hypothesis outright, but I try to steel man it, is that it does have some inherent difficulties. One of them, as you note, being where to draw the line. The other being the peculiar situation where it's very hard to have that debate without coming down on one side of it by the very fact that you're having that debate. That is, if you're not going there, to discuss not going there is like the case of telling someone not to think about a polar bear, speaking of polar bears. Namely, the harder you try, the more you think about it. And so what it requires is multiple levels of genteel ignoring or downplaying or soft pedaling, a kind of social skill that not all academics have mastered. But I would at least raise the possibility that there are certain extraordinary cases. I think it can't be used too easily. Otherwise, too many questions would be deemed out of bounds, and we would be in ignorance of things that we really do need knowledge of, like how to deal with climate change. Any hurt feelings are kind of beside the point. We've got this major problem facing us. We really have to solve it. The truth is more important than anything. In other cases, the scientific benefits might be dubious and the possible social harms high enough that we might think about just prioritizing other things.
This does become a very real world conundrum. In fact, just this week, we were hearing reports that supposedly Harvard, your own university, might or might not have come to a deal with President Trump. The number of $500 million has been bandied around to kind of settle their dispute. How do you feel about that? I mean, in a sense, the battle it wasn't unconnected to common knowledge, in the sense that the critique has been that these institutions have been overly censorious and basically pushing what amounted to a political line, and the administration is trying to bash it down. Do you feel positive about a deal like this?
No, which doesn't mean that I would necessarily oppose it. So if a mugger points a gun at me in a dark alley, it might be advisable not to be a hero, hand over the wallet, but still not feel good about it. And still to think the mugger ought not have done that. Given that he's doing it and he does have the gun, I have little choice. Now, in the case of the Trump administration, I don't honestly believe that they are concerned with academic freedom, with the exchange of ideas, given the entire panorama of their actions. I think it's a more parsimonious hypothesis is, like other authoritarian governments, they're trying to shut down rival sources of power and influence in civil society, including law firms, media outlets, other branches of the government that hold them to account. And we see systematically they're trying to cripple every one of them. The simplest hypothesis is that universities are a nuisance. They'd rather shut them up and disempower them. Because their own rationale for punishing elite universities like Harvard shifts from one directive to another. Some weeks it's anti-Semitism, some weeks it's viewpoint diversity. So I think I don't credit them with a principled stance there. Now the question is, and I don't think that governments ought to be able to conjure arbitrary financial punishments out of the blue to force civil society institutions to heal. I think that is a bad thing in a democracy. It may be illegal. The reason I say maybe is that the second Trump administration has been ingenious in finding loopholes where actions by the government that are patently repressive may not strictly be illegal. They've always been held in place by norms, and they're perfectly prepared to shatter the norms. But Harvard, being in truly an existential fight, namely the research going on at Harvard, together with certain rights like accepting foreign students, like tax-exempt status as a nonprofit, are being threatened by the Trump administration. Harvard would be a very different university if all federal funding were zeroed out. Even though Harvard legally is in the right, unquestionably, the threats of the actions of the Trump administration to cancel funds on the pretext of, say, anti-Semitism are patently illegal. Harvard has won every legal battle so far. I think the law's on its side. But the current Supreme Court in the United States is a wild card. I don't think they have decided on principle grounds, but they clearly have leanings sympathetic to the president. So Harvard would be taking a gamble if these cases were appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, together with the fact that the Trump administration this time around has applied considerable ingenuity to figure out levers of infliction of pain that the government has available that may not be, strictly speaking, illegal. Harvard is being mugged. It may be that the prudent way out to save the university might be to accede to the extortion, given that the alternative might be lethal. And like any lawsuit,
right,
parties to a lawsuit, even if they're in the right, have to calculate, would I be better off settling the suit out of court than taking my chances in court with a possibly unsympathetic judge?
Although being mugged, as an analogy, implies that one is just walking down the street innocently and has no part in the event. But as you have written, I guess it must be said that Harvard and institutions like it, at least in part, brought it upon themselves because, and it's very relevant to this book, I think, because they were overly directed and censorious and not allowing things that were commonly realized to be true to be said. And this is the backlash, and it's ugly and it's over the top. But do they not bear a good deal of responsibility for it?
No, I think they've been perhaps imprudent, unwise, but that doesn't mean that zeroing out research on Alzheimer's disease or energy storage or antibiotic resistance or treatments for depression are in any way a commensurate response. So I think it's I think Harvard ought to reform. I'm at the forefront of a campaign to make Harvard reform. That has nothing to do with canceling grants for fundamental research.
Zooming out, how do you understand the populist, if we call it that, mood in relation to your theories about common knowledge? Because you could, I suppose, make the argument in both directions. Part of what brought President Trump and his equivalents in other countries to power was that they said the thing that many people knew to be true that was not considered permissible to say out loud. They said the quiet part out loud, and people found that very thrilling and liberating, and that was part of their success. And yet I suppose they're also destroying other common knowledge norms at the same time. How do you kind of understand that?
Yeah. So this has to be speculative. The book that I wrote isn't a response to anything happening now. I mean, I hope for it to be relevant in 30 years, and it is an exposition of science and logic and math and so on that could have been published any time. So it's not a response to the moment. But I can try to kind of riff on how it might be relevant to some of the things happening in the news today. So one of the remarkable things about Donald Trump is, and uniquely among American politicians, is that he has violated norms that have been in place, such as you don't boast, you don't blatantly lie. I mean, all politicians lie because all human beings lie, but they lied under the cover of claiming to be honest. With Trump, it's patent that he just doesn't care about factual accuracy. He'll say things that are in his interest and that demonize his opponents with little regard for factual accuracy. Insulting a woman's appearance, insulting war heroes, insulting patriots, insulting his predecessor in office, flattering enemy leaders, insulting allies. All of these things were, there's never a law against them, but it just seemed to be things that a decent leader would not do. By doing them and not suffering consequences, a danger is that he is actually destroying norms that were a pretty good idea. For example, whether he was trolling or semi-serious about, say, annexing Greenland, let alone Canada, my own country, there has been a norm since World War II that nation states are immortal, borders are grandfathered in, aggressive conquest is taboo. Now, of course, like any norm, it can be flouted. Russia is obviously flouting it now. But even to talk about flouting it, even casually, as Trump is doing, I think is a negative development, because that's a really good norm. It might deserve credit for the so-called long peace, the decline in interstate war since 1945, which I've written about elsewhere. So I think this is a bad thing. I think that flouting the norm of at least trying to be honest, not delivering schoolyard taunts and insults to your political adversaries, since democratic governance ought to be a question of honest debate about effects of policies, not primate dominance contests. These are all taking us in bad directions. But on the other hand, it is undoubtedly true that he has changed the landscape, that he has attracted a certain sector of supporters by flouting these norms. In particular, if there's any sympathy for him in the first place, the fact that he is so aggressive and in some ways so ingenious in finding the norms that were mere norms in the sense that one could flout them, whether it be in just norms of genteel political behavior or finding ways of weaponizing the government to punish his enemies. If he's on your side, then the attitude might be like the one attributed to Roosevelt about Somoza. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And the fact that he's supported by, say, evangelical Christians, even though he is the most un-Christian president we've ever had, is a case that as long as he's our champion, we'll forgive him anything.
Do you think, going kind of back a couple of years, that the reason for his support and other similar movements around the world is the prior holders of what was allowed to be said, or the kind of gatekeepers of the official common knowledge, got it wrong in some way? There was a lot of that energy comes from the fact that there was this sort of agreement between the major parties that the world runs in this particular way, views on immigration, views on global free trade, etc., that almost would be preposterous to question. And suddenly people were fed up with that. They wanted to question those things. So in a way, his ascent is also can be seen as a virtuous correction to a sort of policing of common knowledge before it happened. Do you see it that way?
No, well, in part. So yes, it is true that in an era where, just because of limitations of technology, there were fewer channels to generate common knowledge. There was the BBC, there was Time magazine, there were universities, and the gatekeepers there were, in a good way, committed to certain standards of truth-seeking, although they often made errors and they often departed from those canons. Whereas in an era of social media, where there are no longer gatekeepers, everyone can get their own common knowledge, can then be fractionated into different networks of self-referential channels of influence, where the common knowledge is particular to each of these sub-networks. I think causally that has resulted in the breaking open of these norms and of the ability of someone as preposterous as Donald Trump to be elected. So I agree with the causal story, but you also made a normative claim, namely it's good that now there's a greater set of ideas that are taken seriously. If those ideas include vaccines are dangerous, paracetamol causes autism, tariffs make the country better off, that's not a good thing. Now, of course, the rules of the game have to be such that you have freedom of expression, because no one has a monopoly on the truth. It's essential that the gatekeepers don't punish, don't repress knowledge, because the consensus may be wrong. The only way to find out it's wrong is that if heretics are allowed to have their say. But at the same time, one thing we've come to realize, I think, by the explosion of conspiracy theories, quackery, facilitated by social media, is that knowledge is really precious. It's really rare. It's really, really hard, that unless you have institutions that are engineered to pursue the truth, such as, again, I'm talking about the ideal now, science with peer review, demand for empirical falsifiability, open discourse so that a student can challenge a Nobel Prize winner, that kind of meritocracy of ideas. Likewise, journalism, fact-checking, editing, sourcing, printing corrections, judicial system with an adversarial system and rights of the accused. All of these institutions have all of these mechanisms that were implemented just because our own gut feeling about the truth is almost certainly false. And unless we set up the whole system so that it pursues truth, we're guaranteed not to find it. Now, historically, the gatekeepers came to be associated with norms of truth-seeking, institutions of truth-seeking. And what we've learned is, if you just open the floodgates and anyone can disseminate anything, they should have the right to do it. But the result is going to be an awful lot of misconception. As we're seeing now in the empowerment of quackery in the United States with the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services, for example. So yeah, he challenged the consensus and new ideas are coming in, but they're bad ideas. Again, that doesn't mean they should be censored. It doesn't mean they should be punished, but also shouldn't mean that they should be the policy of the government.
So I suppose with the bashing down of those gates and gatekeepers, maybe some good ideas crept through, but it's some bad ideas along with them. And now we're in this almost free-for-all where anything seems to to go.
That's the danger. Yeah.
Ah.
And I don't think, then again, we can't go back. We can't uninvent the internet or social media. It's an unmet challenge how we can restore institutions and norms of truth-seeking in an environment in which that can't be under the control of the gatekeepers of legacy channels of distribution. Just because there are so few of them, it was likelier that they would then get married to norms of objectivity and truth-seeking. And we've faced this challenge, we meaning Western civilization, before when affordable popular newspapers emerged in the 19th century. Most news was fake news. The papers were filled with nonsense about Martian civilizations and two-headed babies and scurrilous rumors about opposite politicians. And then the newspaper industry kind of got its act together. They kind of realized that we're just perpetuating an awful lot of nonsense. And they agreed upon standards and norms such as editing and fact-checking and kind of canons of responsible journalism as we know them, but they had to be invented. When the medium itself was new, it was a free-for-all of misinformation and conspiracy theories and so on.
So that, to me, sounds optimistic, actually, or at least positive, that if you look at previous historical moments where these norms were smashed and suddenly the common knowledge was up for grabs again. The printing press is commonly quoted. You've just mentioned newspapers. They kind of sorted themselves out, or there were revolutions, society changed, but new kind of institutions were built up to deal with that. So do you think that will now happen, that maybe we'll be all right after all?
I'll agree with a maybe. Will it happen? I think it's an unsolved problem. It's much more difficult in the free-for-all of social media. When newspapers, even when newsprint got cheaper and presses got more efficient, there's still only a finite number of them. It's harder now. Whether the solution will be some informal spreading of norms in the same way that, say, society changes norms sometimes not by legislation, but they change in a beneficial direction. The fact that we don't have, in polite society, jokes about effeminate, limp-wristed homosexuals or ditzy blonde women or shiftless, lazy African Americans. I mean, they still exist on the internet, but things that...
Plenty of them on Twitter.
And plenty of them on Twitter. But still, there has been a change, even when I was a child, in my own memory, and a change for the better, not legislated, but a matter of changing norms. So it can happen. Could it happen with looking down on conspiracy theories, not trusting what just came up in your Twitter feed, demanding some kind of verification, truth-seeking, fact-checking is just what intelligent, ordinary, decent people do.
Do you worry for the whole sort of concept of political liberalism in this conversation? Because in a sense, that is one giant norm, isn't it? That all of the institutions you just talked about, the whole settlement that we negotiate outcomes and that we respect certain rules seems genuinely to be threatened at the moment. All of the energy, I would say both on the left and the right, is about tearing down those things or busting. There's a thrill about expanding the official common knowledge and saying new things that were not allowed to be said before. Very few people seem to be getting a lot of attention who are trying to put back norms.
Yeah, no, I am concerned. And, I calibrate my concern to the best data that I can find on the state of the world and the trajectory of the world. So when it comes to, say, liberal democracy, the graphs from the organizations that try to quantify it show that we have been moving a bit backwards. We're still better off than we were in the 20th century. But if you look at the curve of democracy with some ups and downs, kind of hit a peak in the early years of the 21st century, and it's started to droop. Now, again, it hasn't wiped out the progress. I don't believe history is cyclical. But currently it's going in the wrong direction. It's going in the wrong direction in the United States. It's drastically going in the wrong direction in countries like Russia and Turkey. But worldwide, there is something of a recession. So yes, I worry not just because of the anecdotes that I read about, but because there are data that back this up.
Mm. We've just had a number of examples of political violence in recent weeks. Charlie Kirk in the US, and this week we had a terrible attack at a synagogue in Manchester. You have written about how these theories, how your ideas about common knowledge map on to those kind of examples of political violence. A lot of people feel like there's a lot more violence than there used to be, and some people, they might take inspiration from them. How do we understand their effects better?
Yeah, so the response to the Charlie Kirk killing in the United States is something that I've recently written about as an example of what I call a communal outrage. And this was first identified by Thomas Schelling, who in some ways was the discoverer or the first proponent of the idea of common knowledge, where he noted that there's a recurring historical phenomenon where someone gets attacked in a public setting, it's highly publicized, they are perceived as having been singled out because of their membership in a particular group. Members of the group feel a collective outrage. They feel that their status has been lowered or denigrated, that they've been subjugated as a result of this publicity about this event, and therefore feel the urge to lash out to restore their standing, their esteem, their influence, their dominance by attacking almost indiscriminately members of the perpetrator group. And so you have events like the Spanish-American War was triggered by outrage over the sinking of the ship, the USS Maine. The slogan was "Remember the Maine," egged on by the so-called yellow journalism, the newspapers of Hearst, and the United States started the Spanish-American War. The sinking of the Lusitania brought the U.S. into World War I. Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the Tunisian fruit peddler who set himself on fire, triggering the Arab Spring, George Floyd, resulting in a summer of riots and the imposition of critical race theory across American and to some extent British institutions. So the Charlie Kirk killing has been seen, even though it was a kind of deranged, internet-addled loner, it's seen as an attack on the right. And the right in the United States has rediscovered the joys of cancel culture originally invented by the left and have demonized, shamed, mobbed, fired, punished people who have dissented from the posthumous canonization of Charlie Kirk, who said well, he wasn't such a great guy. They've seen their jobs disappear. And the federal government, in the form of the Attorney General, have vowed to crack down on some vast left-wing conspiracy. So it's a replay of this dynamic driven by the kind of group against group status hierarchy, the attack being seen as lowering the influence of a group and the backlash to restore it.
And what are the mechanisms to heal or correct those things? When you look at history or cognitive science, what has worked when groups are in the process of really becoming more divided?
Sometimes these lashing outs are the product of outrage entrepreneurs who won't let a crisis go to waste and kind of egg people on to react. And it is not guaranteed. So I suspect that after the Manchester attack, you won't have mobs of Jews burning down cities. I might be wrong. I suspect that that there isn't going to be that kind of outrage entrepreneur.
That sounds like a good guess.
Yes. Whereas it has happened at other moments of history. And what is the combination of factors? I think largely fomented by outrage entrepreneurs who frame both the perpetrator and the victim of the attack as emblematic of a group against group war.
But that wasn't an answer of how we might correct or heal these. I mean, are there any, will that be the next book? That's what the world really needs right now, isn't it? Like we can observe how these tendencies take place. Are there any examples or tools to try and
I don't think
fix
it's
them?
A simple example because some of these phenomena, unless there's leadership generating common knowledge by announcing something in a public forum where everyone hears it and everyone else hears it. And that's why, by the way, we have things like ceremonies and public forums. We have coronations, inaugurations, weddings, investiture ceremonies to generate common knowledge by announcing something in a forum in which everyone hears it and hears everyone else hear it. That's how social realities are created. Sometimes they're overturned, as when a public demonstration can send a dictator packing. The Ceausescu in Romania was deposed after people in a large public gathering started to jeer. The jeers became contagious, and then people were coordinated because of the common knowledge of hearing others jeer while seeing others hear the others jeer. The regime change often happens when what was private knowledge becomes common knowledge. I cite the line from the Gandhi character in the eponymous movie where he tells a colonial officer, in the end you will leave because 100,000 Englishmen cannot control 350 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate. So the question is, how do you get 350 million Indians or hundreds of thousands of Romanians to refuse to cooperate? You do need the common knowledge. If there's an assembly in a public square, if there is a message sent by a samizdat or other widely distributed form of information, that can generate the common knowledge. People realize it's not just me, it's others as well. But sometimes there's no leader, there's no megaphone, and it's kind of viral. It proliferates. A samizdat would be the example. And that's hard to control because viral phenomena are hard to predict or control. They can grow exponentially. They can start with a seed that no one can predict. So how do you, short of a public forum where you force everyone in and everyone's seeing the same thing, there's no sort of algorithm for generating common knowledge.
And leadership might be a key part of it.
Leadership is a key part, and that's kind of what leaders do, is they generate common knowledge. Of course, leaders also control the police. They have the guns. But Gandhi's principle applies. They don't have enough guns to control the whole population. So a lot of it is engineering common knowledge, which is why autocracies don't have freedom of speech. You might think, well, let the people bitch and moan. The government has the guns. And the reason that no autocrat does permit freedom of speech is because of the mathematics of Gandhi's observation, combined with the fact that multitudes can't coordinate without common knowledge, and so they control the common knowledge with censorship.
Final question for you, Stephen. You're thought of as one of the more optimistic thinkers. Your statistics that you like to wheel out of how the world is getting better in so many ways are often referred to. It's almost the kind of Steven Pinker worldview,
yes,
referred to in shorthand, that no, things are actually getting better, stop being so negative. In the midst of such turbulence that we've had in the last few years, are you as optimistic as ever?
So my two books, Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, do not present a case for optimism. It's not like always look on the bright side of life or see the glass as half full. It's rather, if you understand the world through data, you get a very different picture than if you understand the world through headlines. Because headlines are a non-random sample of the worst things that have happened in the last little while. And they omit the gradual changes that build up by stealth, maybe a few percentage points a year, which then compound, or all the things that don't happen. Southeast Asia isn't at war. That would have been big news when I was a teenager. But you don't appreciate it if you only focus on the events. By presenting graphs, I showed that the reality is that there has been progress. Now, this doesn't mean there always will be progress. It doesn't mean that progress just happens by itself. It only happens when people notice problems, try to solve them. We keep applying the solutions that work, try not to repeat our mistakes. That kind of bumps the curve upwards. But if we stop doing that, or if inevitably there are forces in the other direction, things can get worse. And even historically, the curves that I present, they do have wiggles and bumps and sometimes sickening lurches. If we want progress to happen, I guess the optimistic part is that it did happen, so it could happen. But it only happens if we're attentive to the state of the world, including the danger of regressions and recessions, and try to solve those as new problems.
Is your sense that were you to do a similar exercise in 20 years' time and look at the data, Obviously, you can't predict this. We don't know what's going to happen.
Yes.
But do you feel now that the trajectory is downwards again? I mean, do you think the Steven Pinker update in 20 years' time will be a sad one, or do you think we can recover?
Well, again, I'm going to capitalize on the word can, that modal auxiliary of possibility. Yeah, we can recover. Will we? It kind of depends on what we do. And so in the case of, say, the decline of liberal democracy, first step is certainly noticing it and, being concerned about it and trying to push back against it.
Steven Pinker, we are going to get you back here in 20 years' time, but hopefully before that, thanks for coming into UnHerd today.
Thanks for having me, Freddie.